Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Safe Work Practices in New York City, knowing when and how to use certified contractors when working with lead-based paint. This webinar is being hosted by HPD's Office of Enforcement and Neighborhood Services, ENS for short. We are the office within HPD that employs uniformed staff such as housing inspectors and many other professionals in order to maintain the quality of New York City's housing so that it is safe for all New Yorkers. My name is Phil Weitzman. I'm a senior trainer here within ENS. And also joining us today is Lead-Based Paint Administrative Chief Joseph Ayub. Chief Ayub, would you like to say hello?
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm pleased to be here today.
Before we get into the bulk of our presentation, we'll just take care of a little bit of housekeeping. First thing, we want to make you aware of the features of this webinar platform. This is called a control pane, and it's what you will see if you have joined us by desktop or laptop. If you do not see this, you may want to click on the little orange arrow that you see in the middle of the presentation here, and that may expand the control pane. Two key features here are handouts. We've attached 3 helpful handouts to this webinar that you can download now at your convenience. I will mention for anybody who's watching the recorded version of this webinar that all of these handouts are available on the HPD website as well, so you can find them there. But those of us joining live, you can download them now. The other key feature is the questions or chat feature. This is how you can communicate with us. We encourage you to ask your questions during the webinar at any time that they occur to you, and we'll have designated time at the end to answer your questions. This is also how you can let us know if you are having any kind of technical difficulties. So please do let us know about that. One of our staff will try to assist you, and it's also helpful for us to know if a number of people are having a problem, so then we can pause and attempt to correct the issue before we continue. So the previous slide was the go-to features that you'll see if you're joining us on a desktop or laptop computer. This is what those features may look like if you're joining us via mobile. Same features, slightly different interfaces depending on Android or iPhone, but basically for the questions or chat feature, you're looking for a question mark. And for the handouts, you are looking for an icon of a piece of paper. After this webinar, we're going to be sharing a survey with you. We'll appreciate if you can take a moment to let us know what you thought of this webinar. We always read your comments very carefully. And very important, video recording of this session will be available. So if you want to review these materials, within about 24 hours after the conclusion of today's webinar, you'll receive an automated email with a link to a recording. We'll also be posting that recording to the agency's YouTube page and to our lead-based paint page, so you will have plenty of opportunities to review as much as you would like. A legal disclaimer. This presentation is for informational purposes only and is not legal advice. This presentation is not a complete statement of building owner responsibilities relating to lead-based paint or any other topic. So we're intending this presentation as a general guide to provide basic information about safe work practices. To be sure that you are following the law, you're going to need to do your own research, consult HPD's guides and materials, look at the law, consult an attorney if necessary. And basically, under the law, you are responsible for knowing these rules. We can't tell you everything right now. If you really need ironclad legal advice, please consult an attorney. A few other things to mention. Today's webinar is conceived of as a webinar for people who already have some background in lead-based paint. So if this is your first webinar with us, this is going to be a lot of information. That's okay. You can always go back and review our other webinars, but just to let you know that this may feel like a lot if this is your first time joining us. And another thing is that today our focus is on New York City's Local Law 1 of 2004 as amended, which I'll normally refer to as Local Law 1. So that's this law that HPD enforces. There are also federal rules that may apply, various other jurisdictions that may have rules about lead-based paint. And we are going to be discussing the federal rules a bit today because those are important for safe work practices. But in general, what you're going to get from today's presentation is a lot of information about New York City as a jurisdiction. We aren't going to be describing everything that may apply from other jurisdictions. So let's get to know each other a little bit. It always helps us to have an understanding of our audience so we can speak to your concerns. So let us know which of the following best describes you. Building owner, managing agent or super, tenant, advocate, policy analyst, student, or other. Okay, I see about nearly half of you have voted at this point. Two-thirds have voted. Quarters. And okay, let's go ahead and share the results and see how everybody did. Okay, so it looks like almost all of us are building owners or managing agents and supers. That makes sense because we did advertise this webinar using registration information, the emails that you provided. So that's mostly who we advertise to. I see we have some tenants and some other folks as well. Welcome to you. So I'm going to be addressing building owners and supers as my sort of main audience here today, but there's plenty of information for tenants and for other folks. So all of you, all are welcome, but I'll sort of be addressing my comments to building owners and supers. All right, let's do one more poll here. Why don't you let us know, have you seen one of our webinars before? It's helpful to know the experience level of our audience. Okay, votes are coming in. We've got about 2/3 who have voted. And 3/4, I'll give it 10 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and let's see where everybody is coming from. All right, so a little less than half of you have attended a previous webinar. That's great, welcome back. And we did sort of imagine this presentation for people who have watched a webinar already. And for nearly 60% of you, this is your first time joining us, so welcome. We do have a long section in the beginning where we are going to reiterate the general scope of lead-based paint rules in New York City. So you will have a review of the basics for those of you who are joining us for the first time. And that never hurts for those of you who have a little bit more of experience. Now, again, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, one of the things you're going to see is that lead-based paint regulation in New York City is a complicated topic. So it's likely that you're not going to catch everything the first time. That's normal. It's normal if you may feel a little overwhelmed with the materials, and that's why there are places for you to go do more research. That's why we'll be sharing the recording of this webinar. So just to let you know that you're about to hear a lot, and that's a good thing because that means that you are really getting into learning this complex material. So as I said, we're going to start today with a review of the basics of lead-based paint in New York City, the big picture. Then in our next section, part 2, we're going to dial into some basics about today's topic, which is safe work practices that protect workers and tenants from lead-based paint hazards when paint is disturbed. Then we're going to talk about making sure that when you hire a contractor, that you are hiring the right certified professional for the kind of work that is being done. Then we're going to talk about record keeping. There is a requirement to keep records of lead-based paint activities in New York City's Local Law 1. So we'll get a little bit into what that's going to involve. And then at the end, we'll share some additional resources and notes and we will have time for questions and answers at the end. So let's review our basics. The most basic fact is why we're all here, because lead-based paint is dangerous to children. So lead poisoning negatively affects brain development in young children. And when lead-based paint deteriorates, it turns into harmful dust and chips. Those get into the child's environment where they can ingest it. And children are at particular risk because they explore their environments through hand-to-mouth activity, as we see in the photo at left here, and also because their nervous systems are still developing. So any amount of lead that a child does ingest is going to harm that child much more than the same amount would harm an adult. So children are taking in more lead into their system when there's lead in the environment, and what lead they do is harming them more than that same amount would have harmed an adult. So because of these risks, the sale of lead-based paint for residential use was banned in New York City on January 1st, 1960, and by the United States federal government starting on January 1st, 1978. These two dates are going to come up again and again throughout the presentation, and so we want to highlight them here now. Another interesting point I'll just highlight about this that's relevant for the safe work practices topic is just to notice that sometimes local law can be stricter than federal law. Sometimes the laws don't exactly line up. So that had been the case between 1960 and 78, and there are some ways that that's the case now with safe work practices rules, and we'll discuss that as we go. A key concept for understanding local law 1 in New York City is the concept of the presumption of having lead-based paint. So what local law 1 basically says is that lead-based paint is such a serious issue that when certain criteria are met, we're going to presume that paint has lead in it unless proven otherwise. And those conditions, those criteria where we're going to assume that are if the building was built prior to January 1st, 1960. Again, that's the date where New York City banned lead-based paint. And if the building is a multiple dwelling, which means a building with 3 or more residential units, or a private dwelling, which is a building with 1 or 2 residential units with a tenant-occupied unit. So we could rephrase this and say anything other than a private dwelling that is only owner-occupied. So any building with at least 1 tenant. And then the other concern under local law 1 is if a child under 6 resides in the unit in question. And local law 1 defines resides in a particular way to mean lives in or routinely spends 10 hours or more per week. So that's something to highlight because sometimes if you ask a tenant, does the child live in the apartment, they may say no. But it could turn out there's a child that spends more than 10 hours per week in the apartment, for instance, because the tenant is a babysitter. And so under local law 1, that child would still be considered to reside in the apartment. Another key concept for understanding local law 1 is that although we do have to presume that there is lead-based paint in a wide variety of buildings just based on the age and the other factors I just described, that doesn't mean that those buildings are automatically in violation. It is not a violation of New York City law simply because lead-based paint is in a residential building. So there are a lot of different requirements under the law, but basically the law focuses on lead-based paint that has become a hazard. Because as long as lead-based paint is covered under layers of intact non-lead paint, it is not considered to be an immediate danger. It's still not great that it's there, but it's not an immediate danger. And so the two major concerns that the law, that you're going to see in local law 1 are paint that is deteriorated, such as the picture that we see here. That's obviously paint that is chipping, peeling, and getting into the environment where a child can ingest it, or paint on high-risk surfaces. Examples of high-risk surfaces are the parts of doors and windows that rub against each other, which are called door and window friction surfaces. This rubbing is creating microscopic dust that is still getting into the apartment, and that can also cause a hazard to a child, even though you may not be able to see that dust with your bare eyes. And then the other concern is the presence of a child who can be harmed by those lead hazards that I just described. So there are many more details to the law, but the two big issues are, is the paint deteriorating or getting into the environment, A, and B, is there a child who could be ingesting that paint that's getting into the environment? So what does Local Law 1 ask of you, the building owner or manager? So it asks you to be proactive in preventing lead-based paint hazards. That means that as a city, we are not waiting until children test positive for elevated lead levels in their blood before we seek to make their environment safe. Instead, we want to prevent the child from being poisoned in the first place. And we're taking a lot of steps to do that. So in all of these dwellings where Local Law 1 applies, we are going to find out if children under 6 live in the unit or, again, reside there, so regularly spend 10 or more hours per week under the definition of the law. Most of us are familiar with the annual notice and investigation, where each year you are inquiring about the presence of children. And if there's a child in the apartment, the requirement is for you to follow up by visiting that apartment and doing a visual inspection for deteriorated paint. There are additional requirements whenever a tenant moves out. So when a tenant moves out, there is additional work that must be done before the next tenant moves in. And we call that vacancy period turnover. So when we talk about turnover rules, that's what we're talking about. And then there's today's topic, which is anytime lead-based paint is going to be disturbed, owners must hire contractors with the right certifications, and those contractors have to use safe work practices. I want to go back because there's one feature of the law that I think I didn't mention explicitly. So on this slide, I talked about buildings built before 1960. There is another category of building it's more rare, but this is also covered under Local Law 1. And this is buildings built between 1960 and 1978. So between the date that New York City banned lead-based paint and the date that the federal government banned lead-based paint, where there is actual knowledge of lead-based paint. So a positive test result, something like that, an HPD violation that is based on testing of the paint. So if you know there's lead-based paint in the building and your building was built between 60 and 78, then Local Law 1 is also going to apply in your building. Another requirement I want to highlight for you is that there is a law called Local Law 31 of 2020, which requires building owners to test all units for the presence of lead-based paint by August 2025, all rental units. So that deadline is coming up. If a child under 6 comes to reside in a unit, the testing has to be within 1 year at the time the child came to reside. So that's a few months sooner at this point in May 2024. That's some months before the August 2025 deadline. Now, one thing to keep in mind about this requirement to arrange for testing for all your units is that that's going to give you an excellent index of all of the lead-based paint in your building. And that's going to set you up to apply for an exemption, which is a way to reduce your responsibilities under Local Law 1. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that is a good thing to keep in mind as you begin considering arranging for this testing if you haven't already. All right, so I want to make sure that everybody has a good sense of whether Local Law 1 and the federal safe work practices rules apply to their building. So I'm going to just help talk us through all of this with another poll. So let us know when your building was built. This should be the initial building built to date, the first date of construction. Okay, I see about half of us have voted. Okay, nearly 70%. We'll give it 10 more seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, about 3/4 of us have voted here. And let's see what people said. Okay, so for most of you, your building was built before 1960. Looks like 77% of you. That's going to mean that local law 1 definitely applies to your building, and the federal safe work practices rules apply to your building. Those of you who chose between 1960 and 1978, that's going to mean that unless you have actual knowledge that there is lead-based paint in your building, then you are exempt from the requirements of local law 1. The annual notice, all of the things that I just mentioned, those are not going to apply to you. However, again, if you know there's lead-based paint in the building, then local law 1 does apply. And today's topic is still important for you because the federal safe work practices rules apply to all buildings built before 1978. I'll come back to that. Now, those of you who chose after January 1st, 1978, that's great news for you. That means it is very, very unlikely that there's lead-based paint in your building because your building was built after it was banned federally. And neither the federal requirements or the requirements under local law 1 apply. So that means that basically these complex lead-based paint regulations are not going to apply in your building. Now, for those of you who don't know, that's going to be the key piece of information for you to look at in order to understand whether these provisions apply and which of them do. Now, there's one other small criterion here that I'm going to ask about. The building date is really important, but let's also look at the other piece of the law and let us know, do you own or manage a multiple dwelling or a private dwelling with at least one occupied unit? Okay, I see about 20% of you have voted. About half of us have voted. And just a reminder for anyone who doesn't remember, a multiple dwelling has 3 or more rental units. A private dwelling has 1 or 2 units. I shouldn't say rental, just 3 or more units. Private dwelling has 1 or 2, multiple dwelling has 3 or more. Okay, about 70% of us have voted. I'll close the polls in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's see what everybody said. All right, so for almost all of you, local law 1 is going to apply in your building because local law 1 applies really to every building that has at least one rental unit. That's how we can put it. Now, for those of you, the 5% of you who own a PD where only the owner lives, so I'm guessing most of you own your own dwelling. Again, good news for you. The provisions of local law 1 are not going to apply to your building. However, depending on the date that your building was built, it's still quite likely that there's lead-based paint in that building. You know, if it was built before 1960 or possibly before 78. There may be federal regulations you should be aware of. We're speaking mostly to local law, so keep that in mind. And even in those cases where both New York City law and federal law don't prescribe what you do in your building, if there's lead-based paint there, it can put workers in danger. It can put you in danger if you're doing the work, and it can be a danger to children. So you will not be expected to follow the exact procedures that I'm outlining here necessarily, but I would strongly recommend that you stick around for this webinar, get a sense of what it takes to keep tenants and workers safe using safe work practices, and still build on the first step you've taken here and learn what you need to learn to make sure that any work that is done in your building is done safely. Now, at this point, the next question we almost always get, which we very much understand, is from building owners who believe that there is no lead in their building despite the building built date. And usually the question is, someone saying, my building was built before 1960, but it was gut renovated, so I believe there is no lead-based paint. Do the local law 1 responsibilities still apply? Does the turnover requirement, does the testing requirement apply? And the answer there is yes. There is no exception in the law for gut renovation. And one practical factor to consider is that even in cases where a building is gut renovated, often certain components are reused, such as risers, radiators, and window frames. So the fact of a gut renovation in itself does not prove that there is no lead in a building. But regardless, even if you feel you know there's no lead in the building built date, the original construction date, is the date that is important for local law 1. So that's the date you have to rely on, and if that date was before 1960, then all of the provisions of local law 1 are going to apply to your building. And the next question is from people who say, well, I'm sure though, I believe there is no lead-based paint in any unit in my building. What can I do? And the good news there is that what you can do is arrange for testing. So once you arrange for certified testing to be done that proves that there's no lead-based paint present, then you'll be able to apply for an exemption with HPD, and that exemption will substantially reduce your responsibilities under the law. There's also an option to make some of the lead in your building safe, and there's a different kind of exemption you can receive, even if all the lead-based paint is not removed. So for those of you just thinking about how you can reduce your responsibilities, the real answer is to arrange for testing, which again is actually required by August 2025. So it's something that the law is expecting you to do anyway. And once you do that testing, that's going to set you up to apply for exemptions. We have an entire additional webinar on exemptions that you can find on our website. Now, for those of you joining us for the first time, there's usually some folks who are kind of starting to learn more about these laws and wondering how to get started. So we want to highlight a few quick, easy steps, relatively easy, you can take to be proactive. One is to make sure that you are doing the annual notice and investigation. We have a whole webinar on that, and you could go ahead and add some of the deadlines for the annual notice and investigation to your calendar. Encourage tenants to let you know when there's a child in the apartment of applicable age and if there's peeling paint. You know, we know that it's not always easy to communicate with tenants. Many owners tell us that, but to the extent you have a good relationship, let them know that this is to keep their child safe. You know, this is, it's surprising how many people don't know about the dangers of lead-based paint, even preschool teachers and people who work with children. So make sure that they know, and make sure that they know that you care about protecting their children. There is a lease requirement that with some required notices in the lease signing that you want to make sure that you are giving those to tenants when they sign a lease. These visual inspections I've been mentioning that you might be doing, for instance, if you find there's a child under 6 during the annual notice and investigation process, there's no license required to do that visual inspection, but what we strongly recommend is that you take the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's free, quick, online lead-based paint visual assessment training course. That's going to talk to you about how you're going to be looking for peeling and deteriorated paint when you do that inspection. And the last few things we'll mention as quick, easy steps is one of them is just to do proactive maintenance. You know, take care of issues quickly. Sometimes repainting an apartment may involve sanding, which is disturbing the paint and is going to require safe work practices, as we'll discuss a little bit. But to the extent that you can repaint before the paint is even damaged and avoid sanding, then that's going to save a lot of trouble. Taking care of leaks quickly before the problem gets bad, and just doing other kinds of routine maintenance to avoid paint deteriorating. Most of the requirements of the law kick in once the paint is deteriorated or needs to be disturbed. So if you can avoid that, that's going to be really helpful. And the last thing is to register your buildings. So the live audience, I think you're all pretty familiar with that because again, that's how we reached you for this webinar. But anybody watching the recording, you need to register your buildings with HPD annually, except for rare cases involving private dwellings that you could look at on our website. And by doing that, you're going to get notifications from us when a complaint is filed, when a violation is issued, and you're going to get invitations to webinars like this and important updates about the law. As I said, we have plenty more webinars, plenty more information. I'll just go ahead and share for the first time the URL, the address of our lead-based paint page, www.nyc.gov/lead-based-paint. And there are lots of resources, including links to all our other webinars there. Okay, so we have an overview now of Local Law 1 and when that applies to your building and what it requires when it does apply to your building. We also mentioned a little bit about federal law. Now we're going to dial in, we're going to focus in on today's main topic, which are safe work practices. As I've been saying, federal law and local law are a little bit different when it comes to safe work practices in working with lead-based paint. Both federal and local law have requirements to use safe work practices, and those requirements are the same. So they're both talking about the same thing when they talk about safe work practices. But the federal government has laws that apply all around the country, not just in New York City, for any housing built before 1978 and whether or not there is a child in that building. The New York City government has a different law. Again, that's Local Law 1. And that law has stricter requirements, but those requirements apply more narrowly. So they apply where a child under the age of 6 resides, and for buildings that are within the ages covered by Local Law 1, which is generally before 1960, as we've been discussing. So today we're focusing more on the safe work practices required under Local Law 1. We're also going to mention some of the federal requirements, but we encourage you to do your own research. You can read the laws yourself. You can consult with an attorney and consult with any contractors you hire. Mostly what we're going to be giving you today is a kind of rule of thumb that should be easy for you if you just want to keep it simple and follow both sets of laws at all times. And I'll try to mention a few areas where they're a little bit different. So again, if you want to be very precise and avoid any extra responsibilities, you can do some of your own research, but what we'll really be giving you are some rules of thumb that if you follow them, then you'll be following both sets of laws, despite the fact that they're a little bit different. So what are safe work practices? These are requirements for any work area where lead-based paint is disturbed that are there to protect the workers doing the work and the building occupants from being exposed to dangerous lead-contaminated materials. And something we'll keep coming back to is that proper certification is required in order to perform safe work practices. So even if I follow the safety steps that are outlined under the rules, if I don't have the right certification, then the work I did is not going to pass muster under the law. Where must safe work practices be used? Once again, in all buildings constructed before 1978. Local Law 1 is a little less broad than that, but for the simple rule of thumb, federal law applies to all buildings constructed before 1978. So if you want to follow federal law, you can go ahead and follow safe work practices. Consider them in any situation where the building is built before 1978. Now, when must safe work practices be used? Once we know we have a building built before 1978, we have another question, which is how large is the job? So once the job is more than a small size, safe work practices are going to be required. And that small size is pretty specific. So it's when the job is going to disturb more than 2 square feet or 10% of a small component of paint that is either lead-based paint or paint that hasn't been tested, so we can't say either way, in a room. So this requirement does apply per room, so it would be the more than 2 square feet or 10% of a small component in each room. The 2 square feet don't have to be next to each other. They don't have to be a continuous area. So in some cases, it could be like the square that you see in this image. The 2 square feet could all be covering that square. And that would be a way of applying the rules, but it could be that we have 1.5 square feet on the north wall of the room, 1.5 square feet on the south wall of the room. Together, that's going to add up to 3 square feet, which is more than 2 square feet. Now, the 10% of a small component is going to be something like a door frame casing, like we see here in the slide, a windowsill, or a baseboard. Those are those are just a few examples of what is considered to be a small component. Now again, who's doing safe work practices? Trained and certified professionals. Without the certification, it's not safe work practices. So most of the time, that's going to mean that when you want safe work practices done, you're probably hiring outside contractors who have the appropriate EPA certifications for the type of work to be done. The EPA website has search tools for you to find them. We'll show you that in a little bit more detail a bit later in the presentation when we're going to give you examples of which certifications are required for which kind of work. But for now, just to mention, if you're interested in finding a contractor, the EPA website is one place that you can start. You also will have an option to get yourself and or your building staff certified. In order to do that, you'll need a firm license as a firm that can work with lead-based paint, and every worker that you hire to do the work will also have to have a license. So that is also an option for you as a building owner. The one thing to mention is that there is a part of the safe work practices process that always has to involve an outside independent contractor, and that is called clearance. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but even if you do get the certifications, you'll always be hiring an outside contractor, at least for that clearance part. Here are some examples of what you're going to see in a work site where safe work practices are being used. You're going to see signage. That signage is going to warn people not to enter the work site because there is dangerous lead contamination in that site. And it has to be posted at the entrance of the work site. You're going to see lots and lots of plastic sheeting covering the floor, covering the walls, covering the ceiling, and covering any openings such as windows or HVAC registers. And what that sheeting is going to do is ensure that lead dust that is created and lead materials that are created are going to fall onto the sheeting rather than getting into the cracks in the hardwood floor and into the nooks and crannies in the apartment where they can still cause damage. You'll also notice this sort of plastic sheeting entryway that you can see here. And that's an area for the workers to put on and take off their protective equipment to prevent tracking dust out of the work site. Another key aspect of safe work practices are what are called wet methods. And that basically means that when lead-based paint is being disturbed, especially sanded, it's always being spritzed with water. And that water is going to cause the dust to become heavier and fall onto the plastic sheeting where it can be easily cleaned instead of dispersing into the air. And then at a site where safe work practices are being used, daily cleanup is required, wet mopping and vacuuming with a HEPA vacuum. Here are a few examples of prohibited work methods. You should not see these at any work site. Open flame burning or torching of the lead-based paint is not allowed, and dry scraping or sanding, which is the opposite of wet methods. That's the method that's going to create dust that is going to disperse into the air. A few other examples of methods that are not allowed are machine sanding, unless there is HEPA exhaust control, and stripping the paint with harmful chemicals. So when you hired a contractor and you're expecting them to use safe work practices, if you see that they aren't, you should stop the job immediately and have a discussion with them and, either make sure that they can follow the safe work practices going forward or simply fire that contractor and start over. So as the building owner, it is your responsibility ultimately to make sure that safe work practices are being used. If they aren't, stop the job. And we want to stop the job. We want to be very careful about safe work practices because there are a lot of dangers if they aren't used. The most important one is that children can be exposed. In addition, the workers doing the work are also being exposed to lead dangers if safe work practices aren't being used. There is also a lot of different possibilities for enforcement. So here in New York City, HPD enforces these rules, as well as the Department of Buildings and the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, they have their own complaint investigation and enforcement process. And so there may be financial penalties if safe work practices are not used, as well as the fact that tenants may initiate their own legal action. Okay, so up to this point, we've analyzed our building to determine the date that it was built and whether the requirements of local law 1 and the federal requirements apply to our building. And let's say that we've determined that they do. Now we've looked at the basics of what safe work practices are. So we have a sense of what we're going to need to expect if we hire a contractor. We have a sense of what size job is going to trigger the safe work practices requirements. And now we need to hire a certified professional in order to do the work. Or maybe we're using our own staff, but we need to make sure that the staff that do the work have the proper kind of certification. In order to do that, what we have to understand is that there are two kinds of work categories under the law. And those two different categories have two different kinds of licenses that the workers need to have. So if the work is general repair and renovation, there's one license to look for. If the work is abatement, there's another license. General repair and renovation is by far the larger category of work. That's going to be most of the work that's done in an apartment. All of your typical renovation and repair that's going to happen in the routine course of maintenance is going to fall into that category. Abatement work is much narrower. So abatement work is work that is specifically intended to remove lead-based paint. That's a narrower category. To go into a little more detail, let's talk about this. Again, I'm going to repeat myself a slightly different way. To classify the work as abatement, that's going to mean that the intent of the work is to permanently eliminate lead-based paint in a building, a unit, or from a component, to get rid of the lead-based paint. Now, I will mention, just for you to keep in mind, that that phrase permanent elimination can be a little more complicated than it appears, because there are certain kinds of abatement methods that don't actually remove the paint, but are considered to last at least 20 years, and that meets the definition of abatement. And two of those methods are called encapsulation, where the paint is covered under a thick protective gel, or enclosure, where another surface is placed in front of the surface with the lead paint. And so those surfaces have to be monitored. You know, ultimately, the category of abatement can be a little bit complex, but basically, if we want to keep it simple, abatement is work that is intended to be a permanent elimination of the lead-based paint. Now, general repair and renovation is essentially any other work that disturbs lead-based paint. As I said, most of that other work is going to be your routine maintenance. So some examples would be if there's a leak behind the wall and the plumber has to open the wall up in order to get at the leak. You hired them as a plumber. You didn't hire them as a lead-based paint professional, but the work that they do is still disturbing more than 2 square feet or 10% of the component. And so they still need to know how to work safely with that lead that they disturb. Similarly, an electrician who might be rewiring some old wiring behind the wall. If they have to tear the wall up in order to do that, if they're disturbing more than that amount that we've been discussing, then they need to be able to work with that lead paint that they're disturbing safely. Perhaps the most common example of general repair and renovation work is repainting an apartment. Now, in theory, if you're repainting, you may not need to disturb any paint, but typically the repainting process also involves sanding. And so if you are sanding down paint, that's disturbing it. And if it's more than 2 square feet or 10% of the small component, then that's going to fall under this general repair and renovation requirement, and you'll need to use contractors with the proper licenses. I do want to mention there's another category that falls under general repair and renovation, which is sometimes there's work that you might do because you're concerned about a lead issue, but at that time, you're not intending to remove the lead, but just to make it safe. So perhaps you do your annual notice and investigation. You find that there's a child under 6 in an apartment. You visit that apartment, you see that there's some paint that's peeling, and at this time, you decide not to go forward with abatement. You're not going to strip all of the lead paint from the wall, and instead you're going to stabilize and cover up that paint. So that would be another example of work that would fall under general repair and renovation. You'll typically hear that kind of lead-based paint work referred to as remediation or interim controls. But one other thing I'll mention now is that different jurisdictions may refer to these kinds of work in slightly different ways. So that's something to keep in mind. Here today, we're using these terms general repair and renovation and abatement because they work well for our webinar today. But you may see these words used differently. You may see slightly different terms that are intended to mean the same thing. So that is just something for you to keep in mind as you read different materials from different agencies. So just a heads up to you, it took me a while as I was learning this material to realize that. And it's confusing until you do realize that. So I'm hoping to save you a little bit of confusion by giving you that heads up. Now, under Local Law 1, there's a special circumstance for certain kinds of general repair and renovation work. And that's to say that if general repair and renovation work is being performed in a situation where Local Law 1 applies, so the building is built before 1960 and a child under 6 resides, and it's a very large job, which is defined as a job that's going to disturb more than 100 square feet of lead-based paint in a room, or result in 2 or more painted windows being removed. Then there are some additional requirements. This contractor is actually going to need to have 2 different lead-based paint licenses. One is going to be the license to do the general repair and renovation work, because that's the nature of the work being done. So you need the license to do the work that will be done. But the law also specifies that that contractor must also have an abatement license. So that contractor will need to have 2 different licenses. And there's some additional requirements that are going to apply in these situations. There is a notice of commencement that must be provided to the Department of Health. There's some additional signage that needs to be posted at the work entrance. So if you have work that falls within this situation, consult the rules and perhaps discuss with the contractor, discuss with an attorney if needed to make sure that you understand the requirements for this larger kind of job. Let's take a look now at what these licenses look like. All workers who do either kind of work, either general repair and renovation or abatement, need to be trained and certified. This is what the renovation, repair, and painting certificate looks like, and this is the certificate that is used for general repair and renovation work. Most often you'll hear this referred to as an RRP certificate. You may also hear it referred to as a lead safe certificate, and that's referring to this EPA insignia on the left. You'll see this license for particular firms, as in the example that we see here. Also, workers will have this license. And so this is what it looks like. You'll see firms referred to as renovation firms. You will see workers being called renovators. And so those are the most common ways that these can be referred to. But again, just to keep in mind that sometimes people may refer to them in different ways. This is the abatement certification. Now, in this case, this certificate is commonly referred to as an abatement certificate, but the word abatement does not appear anywhere on the certificate. The phrase that you're going to be looking for is lead-based paint activities. That's the phrase you're going to be looking for. And this certificate covers a wide variety of different roles. It's going to, you're going to have a certificate like this for the firm, the abatement firm. You'll also have a certificate like this for the workers who do abatement. There's a supervisor certificate, and then there are lead abatement worker certificates. And the supervisor has to be present in order for those workers to do work. You'll also see this license for 2 other kinds of lead-based paint roles, which are lead inspector and risk assessor. Those are the folks who test surfaces to see if lead is present. Those might be the people that you hire to do your testing of all the units in your building. And those are also the folks who can do clearance, which is what we are about to talk about. Now, I want to just repeat that these licenses are for different kinds of work. So if a firm has this abatement license, they cannot do general repair and renovation work unless they also have the general repair and renovation license. Similarly, if the firm has this general repair and renovation license, they can't do abatement work. So a firm could have one license or the other license or both licenses. You want to make sure that they have the right license for the situation that you are hiring them for. Okay, so we analyzed the date our building was built. We looked at the size of the job to confirm that safe work practices were required, and they were. We hired the right contractor for our situation. The contractor did the job, the contractor cleaned up the work site, and now we have one more step, which is called clearance. Clearance is the process of making sure that the work site has been cleaned properly so that it is safe for the tenants to go back in. And clearance is required for both general repair and renovation and abatement work. This is an example of a contractor taking clearance measures. This is dust wipe sampling. So you can see that the contractor has placed a template on the floor, and what they are about to do is they're going to wipe that area of the floor with a wet wipe in a specially prescribed way. And then they're going to put the wet wipe in one of the vials that we see at the bottom right of the photo, and they're going to send that to an independent lab certified by New York State, and that lab is going to do testing to determine whether or not the site is safe to reoccupy. It's very important to highlight that we have to do clearance because visual inspection is not enough to tell whether there's a dust hazard in the apartment. So, sometimes it might be obvious that the site wasn't cleaned properly because there's visible dust. That's an easy situation where we know there needs to be additional cleaning. But even if a floor is spotless, it's been mopped, it's been buffed, it looks like brand new. If the work was done in a reckless fashion, it is still possible that there is extremely damaging amounts of lead-based paint, dust on that surface, microscopic dust. So that's why we have to do dust wipe sampling, because visual inspection just doesn't give us a sense of the dangers. There's a few other things to mention about dust wipes. The samples have to be taken at least an hour after the work area has been cleaned. We have to wait because dust takes time to settle. So we want to make sure that the sample is capturing that dust that has taken time to settle. Tenants should not go back into the area until the dust wipes come back below the threshold. There is a limited option for them to reoccupy, but that's going to involve filling out a checklist, and that we're not going to get into that in today's presentation. It's better if they just don't go back in. And independence. I mentioned this before, but whoever does this dust wipe sampling has to be independent of both the building owner and the contractor. And this is basically an integrity control to ensure that there's no conflict of interest where the contractor may feel beholden. So that means that even those of you who get your own certifications, you'll always be hiring an outside contractor, at least for the dust wipe process. If you want to have more detail about the dust wipe thresholds, you can visit our website and the Department of Health's website. Something to keep in mind is that the thresholds are currently different, I believe, for federal and local. So you'll want to make sure that your contractor is going by the local New York City dust wipe threshold. Now, we always get a lot of questions from people asking how they're going to find their contractors. And I saw some questions coming in very early in the webinar. People were asking about safe work practices contractors and also about finding people to do the testing, that require testing in their buildings. So As a government agency, we cannot recommend particular contractors to you, but what we can tell you is that the EPA website has two separate search tools for each kind of certification. So one for the general repair and renovation category, and one that you can use to find abatement firms and to find risk assessors and lead inspectors. And those are the folks who can do your dust wipe sampling. And you might hire one of those in order to arrange for that testing as well. One other thing we'll mention, we just put this in the chat for you, is that the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene has a list of companies that cannot do certain kinds of lead-based paint activities in New York City. There's a link to that on the HPD website. You can find it on the Department of Health website. There are only a few companies listed, but you definitely want to make sure that you don't hire one of those companies to do the work. Okay, let's talk about record keeping. Record keeping is about being able to prove that you have taken all of the required steps to follow the law. New York City's Local Law 1 requires you to keep records for at least 10 years related to all lead-based paint activity. And here we really are focusing on the New York City requirements. You'll want to check EPA resources for any federal record keeping requirements. Now, for the New York City requirements, we have an entire webinar dedicated to the topics of annual notice and record keeping. And what that webinar does is it basically uses the annual notice and investigation process as an example of how you can keep records. And it goes into quite a bit of detail. So if you want to really delve in, you can go to that webinar where you'll really see an example, step by step, task by task, of what it will look like to keep records of your lead-based paint activities. For safe work practices, we want to highlight some of the documents that you'll need to collect. These are all documents that would be requested from you by HPD if your building were selected for an audit. And so you're going to want to make sure that you get these from the contractors. Strongly recommended to get them during the job or as soon as the job is over where applicable, so that the company doesn't go out of business or workers change or it just becomes much harder to get these the more time goes on. So you're going to want to get these from contractors as soon as possible. The first thing are certifications for the firm, for the people who performs the work, and the people who did the dust wipe clearance testing. Just a note that if you do hire a sole proprietor, they will still have to have a firm certification and a worker certification. So even if you're hiring a sole proprietor, they will need to have two kinds of licenses. There are also some sworn statements that you will need to collect from those workers and from the firm. So we have examples of those on our website. It's actually listed under violations on our web lead-based paint page. Those are affidavits that are required for HPD violation clearance, but they also can be used for other record keeping purposes. So if you want an example of an affidavit, you can go ahead and get that from our website. You're also going to want the description and location of the work done in each room and invoices for the work that was done. You'll need to keep the lab results from the dust wipe sampling. And if the occupant is allowed temporary access to the space, then there's a checklist that you're going to need to keep. Beyond this, if the job meets that large job requirement that we talked about, of over 100 square feet of lead-based paint being disturbed in a room, or 2 or more painted windows being removed, then there are some additional steps that are required, and you'll want to keep records for those as well. One tip that we can give you based on the experience of our clerical staff, aside from get the records quickly, is check the dates on these records when you get them, especially on the certifications. So let's say I hired a contractor this month to do a job. Sometimes contractors just, they lose track of something, and maybe they give me the copy of their license that expired back in December of 2023. It could be that and hopefully is the case, that they have the correct license, but they just forgot to send me the correct file. We need the certifications that cover the period where the work was done. And the same thing goes for all these records. So take a look at these records, check the dates, and make sure that they are specifically for your situation. At this point in the webinar, we usually have some folks who are learning about some things for the first time maybe, and they're wondering what their next steps should be. So we have some advice for you. It's all fairly basic and common sense, but compile any records you do have of your lead-based paint activities, records of repairs, including invoices, emails, descriptions of work, records of any testing that has been done in your building. Something to keep in mind in general is that you may be asked to provide all of your lead-based paint records for your building, either through an audit or other circumstances. And so it's a good idea to be filing those in one place as you go. So if you have work that's done in an apartment, perhaps you are keeping all the work for apartment 3B in a folder for 3B. I'm just imagining a particular situation. You might want to, and this is not required, it's just a thought, you might want to copy any records relating to lead-based paint into a separate lead folder so that when somebody asks you for your lead records, you can just provide them immediately without having to go comb through a bunch of other different files. Now, if you haven't been following all these rules, if you haven't been keeping records, if HPD selects your building for an audit, you're likely to receive a violation. The violation will have information on how to correct the condition and other next steps. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you're purchasing a building, you should ask for the required records. There is a process if the owner doesn't have the records, but it's better to just get them from the owner wherever you can. Now, as a tool to help you with your record keeping, HPD has a number of sample forms. These forms are not required at all, but if you're wondering how to get started, they will be very, very helpful to you. They're going to help you document that you're following the law. They're tailored to the specific provisions of Local Law 1. And so they're also going to help you learn the law and understand the law. However, it is important to adapt the forms as needed. The forms are just a tool. They don't cover absolutely everything. So you have to understand the law for yourself as you use these forms. Again, we have our annual notice and record keeping webinar. In that webinar, we go into a lot of detail on record keeping, and we use HPD's sample forms as an example. So you can see a lot of detail in what it might look like to use these forms for yourself. Here is our form for safe work practices that we provide. And you can see that there are a lot of helpful instructions as to additional things to attach. There's an area to list the area where work was done, some questions to establish whether safe work practices are required to be used in that area, and then questions about whether Local Law 1 applies. Is there a child under 6? Will the work disturb more than 2 square feet in a room? Will the work disturb more than 100 square feet or remove 2 or more painted windows, and so forth. Now, again, federal requirements would apply even if there's no child, for instance. So this form is tailored to Local Law 1, and this form is going to allow you to respond to an HPD audit. You could check the EPA website for any sample forms or aids they have for you in that regards, but this one is just for the rules that HPD enforces. And just a small note, for space reasons, in this column, it says more than 2 square feet in a room. It doesn't mention the 10% of the small component. So that is just why it's expected that you know the law for yourself and you're using this form as an aid, but you can't rely on it in itself to walk you through absolutely every required step. Then there are areas to indicate the dates of work and whether clearance was performed and the results of clearance, and when the clearance results were shared with the tenants. Here's just some examples of what it might look like to fill out this form. The colors are not required. That's just for ease of reading during this presentation. But this is just an example. And again, our annual notice webinar uses a different topic to provide a lot of detail on what it looks like to fill these forms out. Okay, we're coming to an end. We're just going to share some final notes and additional resources. there are some new requirements coming up. So at the beginning of this webinar, we talked about the general requirements under Local Law 1. The City Council has passed a number of laws recently that are going to expand those requirements and change them a bit. One thing to be aware of is that you're going to get an additional option for dismissing record-keeping violations. Basically, that new option is going to allow you to submit less than the required 10 years of records in exchange for paying a fee. The testing requirement for all rental units is going to be expanded to common areas. HPD inspectors are going to start issuing lead-based paint violations for common areas. It was always against the law to have lead-based paint hazards in common areas, but now previously our inspectors were only checking for that inside rental units. Now they're going to start checking in common areas. And when a lead-based paint violation is issued, HPD is going to start requesting additional documentation. So not just documentation of the work that was done to clear that violation condition, but also annual notice and investigation records for the building. So now is a good time to get your building records in order in anticipation that you may receive a lead-based paint violation at some point. You'll want to have your annual notice and investigation records ready to share. Those changes are expected in 2024. There's another one expected in 2025, where the requirement to treat door and window friction surfaces is going to be expanded. Currently, it's required whenever the apartment is vacant, but it's going to expand to include any unit with a child under 6. So that's going to be non-vacant units, and those surfaces will have to be abated, which again is the solution that involves permanent elimination of the issue. People are always thinking about exemption by the end of our webinars if they weren't thinking about it from the beginning. And so we just want to remind you that exemption is an option. If you arrange for testing in your unit, which you are required to do by law at any rate, you can show that there is no lead-based paint in that unit and then apply for an exemption with HPD that could include no annual notice and investigation requirements, no turnover requirements, reduced or eliminated record-keeping requirements, and reduced or eliminated safe work practices requirements. Now, the exemption benefits are saying reduced or eliminated because there's another kind of exemption where you just show that there may still be some lead in the unit, but that lead has been made safe. So depending upon whether all lead is eliminated or some lead remains but has been made safe, the kind of exemption benefits will change a bit, but either way, this is an excellent option for you as a building owner. And again, we have an entire additional webinar on this. There is plenty more to learn on our website. We have a lot of helpful resources for you about all kinds of topics, not just lead-based paint. Particularly our online search database, HPD Online, just got a nice upgrade. It's much easier to use than it had been, and you can find lots of helpful information there about your building. If you have questions about registering your property or updating your property registration, we have a page there. And we have lots of information about safety and maintenance, including a really helpful booklet called the ABCs of Housing. That booklet has a wealth of information, including some not-for-profits that are there to help building owners. So that's something for you to take a look at. And then our lead-based paint page that I've been mentioning, it has all kinds of information for you. Again, the URL is www.nyc.gov/lead-based-paint. There's lots more to learn about lead here, and in particular, you can take a look at the briefings to learn more and the webinars. You can also reach out to HPD's lead-based paint unit, and that's particularly what we recommend you do if you have a situation particular to your building. Their phone number is 212-863-5501. Again, that's 212-863-5501. There is also a portal on the HPD lead-based paint page where you can schedule an appointment with them to meet with them about your topics. So that's a very nice, helpful option. As we said, much more in our other webinars. Stay tuned for additional webinars. And as we prepare to take questions and answers, we'll just reiterate that here today, we won't be able to answer any particular questions for your building. So, if the question starts with, well, I have a tenant who's doing this, and my building was built on this date, and we don't want to answer those questions here. A, because we want our answers to be helpful for all of our audience, but also because you deserve to talk to someone who can take more time to go through all of the details of your situation. And we don't have that time here today. Again, take a moment to fill out the survey. After you log off of the webinar, we appreciate your feedback, and stay tuned for the video recording. And now we're going to go ahead and answer some of your questions. Chief Ayub, do you see any questions that you would like to jump in and answer?
By all means, Phil. A question came in from Victoria. Victoria states that in the building, there's a woman who's pregnant. Does she have to do the testing within 1 year? So the simple question for that, Victor, is once the baby is born, you have 1 year to do the testing, or the testing must be done before August the 9th, 2025, whichever date is sooner. So once the baby is born, you have 1 year to do the testing, or the testing must be done before August 9th, 2025, whichever date is sooner.
Okay, any other questions you saw coming in?
One question I believe you already answered, Phil, is a lot of folks are inquiring about where they could find firms to do XRF testing. And as you stated before, it's a conflict of interest for HP to give out those firms' names, but we highly recommend you go to the EPA website, whereby you could put in your zip code, and they will give you a host of firms in your neighborhood. And you get to choose. You could also Google.
Okay. Let's see. We have a question from Eric, there's a lot of facets to his question, so maybe I'll start to answer it, and if you have anything to add, let me know, Chief. Eric asked, if we are concerned that lead-based paint exists, can we simply encapsulate with the correct product? And if so, what level of certification does the person performing the work need? Eric, one thing to keep in mind here is that the answer might be different in a different jurisdiction, but it is going to be required to test for all units for lead-based paint under New York City law. So I understand the reasoning of just going ahead and treating it as if it has lead, but you will actually need to test it anyway. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, I would recommend that you have once you know that there is lead, there are a lot of different options that you may have. The term encapsulation specifically refers to abatement work, and so the person performing that work would need an abatement license. And as it happens, encapsulation also requires an additional certification to be used. But encapsulation is typically done on components like windowsills. It's not as far as I'm aware, it's not a solution that would apply for like that you would encapsulate an entire wall. There's a different technique called enclosure that could apply there. But again, beyond giving you some general information here, I think you're going to need to have a conversation with your contractor and learn a little bit more, because questions like yours are very case specific. So I hope that's a little bit helpful. Do you have anything to add, Chief?
Yes, Phil, I may add, while it may seem a lot cheaper to do encapsulation on wall, ceiling, or like you said, the windowsill, you must also factor every 2 years you have to pay to have that area monitored by a risk assessor. So after a while, the fee does add up. So basically, if you do encapsulation, you need to pay a risk assessor every 2 years to monitor the condition of those surfaces for the life of the material, usually 20 years. So that does add up in terms of cost.
That's a great point, Chief. As I had mentioned, the abatement techniques of encapsulation and enclosure are a little bit confusing, because abatement as a category is basically defined as techniques that permanently solve the problem. But in fact, certain very safe techniques that are used under abatement do not remove the paint and therefore are not really permanent. And if you use those techniques, you still have to continue monitoring the component. I see a question coming in from Avi. That's a great question. This is really about the testing requirement, but it's worth covering here. Avi asks, in a high-rise building, is the interior stairwell considered a common area to be tested for lead for exemption? Chief Ayub, I have an idea of the answer, but I think you have the exact language at hand. Would you want to tackle that one?
By all means, Phil. As per the law, the common area is defined as a portion of a multiple dwelling or any rental building that is not within an apartment and is regularly used by occupants to go to and from their apartment. So in this case, yes, the stairwell will be considered a common area.
Thanks, Chief.
And this is related to another question that someone else asked also about the fire escape. No, the fire escape is not commonly used to go in and out of the apartment. So the fire escape will not be considered a common area.
Okay. And just to highlight, there are certain building areas, such as the laundry room, that are not normally used by tenants as part of the entrance and exit of the building. So something like a laundry room would not be considered a common area under this testing requirement.
That is correct, Phil.
Okay. There's a lot of good questions coming in. I see somebody asked, let's see here, after testing, how long do you have to repair? That was a question from Kelsey. So Kelsey, there's a lot to your question. The testing requirement is really designed to give you a sense of where the lead-based paint is in your building. And there is no requirement to do repairs just because you find lead-based paint. So as we've been saying, if that lead-based paint is successfully contained under intact layers of non-lead-based paint, then there may be no work that is required to be done. Now that might be a little different if it's we've been over a lot of different circumstances and there are additional rules coming down the pipeline. But basically, just because you have lead-based paint in your building, it does not mean that you are in violation of the law. It does not mean that there's any work that you have to do. The question is, once you have that testing done, are any of the surfaces or components that have lead, are they not intact? If you test a wall in an apartment, if that wall is totally intact, there's no additional step required at that time. But if there's peeling paint on that wall, then you would need to take steps. But I guess stepping back here, that probably meant that the law was requiring you to presume there was lead anyway. So hopefully before that, the testing was done, you were doing your annual notice and inspection, and you already saw that peeling paint. So a lot of times in general, people will ask a question like yours, Kelsey, and it's hard to give you exactly one answer. And that's because there's really no substitute for simply listing all the requirements of the law. You know, there's annual notice and inspection. You also have to respond if a tenant lets you know about a problem, even if it's not during that annual period. There are things to do when the apartment is vacant. There are things to do whenever lead-based paint is being disturbed. There is the testing requirement. All of those things are related but distinct. And so the best way to know if you are following the law, unfortunately, there's no substitute for simply familiarizing yourself with each of those separate provisions and understanding the different times that those come into play. Any other questions that you see, Chief?
No, I just want to add something to this particular questions. In terms of the testing, if the walls, for example, are positive, right, and they're peeling, and there's a child under 6 there, then a hazard is present, and the owner have to remediate the hazard.
Okay, thank you, Chief. Let's see here.
There's one about a 2-family house Phil, you want to answer that one?
Okay, let me take a quick look.
With one rental.
I'm not seeing that one. Like, do you want to read it out loud for me and I'll answer it?
By all means, I have a two-family house with one small rental unit. Do I have to test the entire house or just the one-family house where the rental is? Or the
You know,
two-family?
actually, Chief, I'm not particularly familiar with that. Could you, that's why we need experts here. Could you go ahead and tackle that one?
So basically, all rental units need to be tested before August of 2025. So in this case, it's a two-family house. The owner live in one unit and they're renting the other unit out. The other unit need to be tested. Under the definition of rental units need to be tested by August 2025.
Okay. Now I'm seeing some questions about the EPA website. So as we draw to a close, I don't want to take the time to go ahead and navigate to the site. The main thing I'll mention is that there are two different searches that you'll want to look for. If you know that the kind of work that you need to do is what we've been calling general repair and renovation, then you want to look for the RRP, renovation, repair, and painting license. And then there is a separate section of their website where you can search for abatement firms and risk assessor and lead inspector licenses. So I hope that's a little bit helpful as people are asking how to get to that website. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Chief, anything else come in that catch your attention?
There's a question from Alvi. She says she have a three-family house. She already applied for 3 units to be exempted. Does she need to apply separately for the common area? Yes, Alvi, you need to apply for the common area. If you are granted an exemption for the common area, HP will not ever issue a violation for the common area for presumed lead-based paint.
Thank you, Chief. I see a question from Fernando asking, Fernando asks, those apartments that were renovated after 2020, do they still need lead paint inspection? And the answer there, Fernando, is yes, they do. Basically, this law applies unless otherwise specified. So what I mean by that is that there are lots of very understandable, reasonable things you could think of. You might be thinking, oh, I got renovated that apartment. I think there's no lead-based paint. You know, do I still have to follow these rules? But the answer is going to be yes. In this case, the law that applies based on the building built date. There's no specified exception for any dates of renovation. So you'll still need to arrange for that lead-based paint inspection in those units. Okay, so I see one more question. Let's take one more question. We do apologize, we can't get to all your questions. We had about 100 people join us today, and there are many good questions that have come in. This question is from Pari. And the question is, currently, if you find lead on non-friction surfaces, are we required to abate if the child is under 6 years? What about friction surfaces? So I want to just highlight again that just finding lead, just because the surface has lead, does not mean you're required to take any action. The issue is going to be if that lead becomes a hazard. Most of the time, that's going to be that the paint is deteriorated. But for door and window friction surfaces, there are additional requirements to abate at the time of turnover and coming soon simply if there's a child under 6. Especially when it comes to door and window friction surfaces, we do encourage you to abate, but it may not be required. You're going to want to take a look at the law, and it could be that you have options. It could be that you choose to remediate and just make the paint safe, or choose to abate based on what makes the most sense in your building. So again, just because you find lead does not mean you have a violation yet. The question is, has that lead become hazardous? You know, again, the topic today is work going to be done that disturbs the lead, then certain requirements are going to kick in. So as I said, I believe to Kelsey as well, sometimes there's no quick answer to a question like that, there are just a lot of possible scenarios, and you'll want to just review all the different provisions of the law to see where they apply and intersect with your question.
And like Phil said, we're sorry we're not able to answer all of these questions, but by all means, we will very love to answer all of them. Just give us a call at our number 212-863-5501, and you may ask for me, Joseph Ayub. I'll gladly answer those questions.
Okay, that's an invitation from one of the best experts in New York City. So I hope everybody appreciates Chief Ayub's availability. And as we said, you can also visit the web-based paint page and schedule an appointment to meet with someone to talk you through your questions and your particular situation. So with all that being said, I think it's time to wrap up for the day. I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next lead-based paint webinar. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody.